Hey, it's Nicholas here with a 20-minute presentation reviewing the paper True Consciousness Science Requires Strongly Dynamically Unorthodox Physics, which you can find at this URL or on the Center for Dialogue in Science website. And in the second half of today's presentation, I'll be reviewing this paper's core technical content, the meta-Hamiltonian argument. Before we get onto that, I should emphasize that whenever I use the word consciousness today, I mean what philosophers call P-consciousness, that is phenomenal consciousness, or what everyday folks call conscious experience. For example, the very blackness and redness and whiteness and blueness that you're seeing on your computer screen right now. Now, before we get to the technical stuff in part 2, I'm going to set up an informal context to help you understand a paper that's deliberately been written in quite an austere and very succinct way. So now, obviously, the paper is about consciousness science, and it's about dynamics in the sense of dynamical activity as a way to transfer information from A to B, as described in physical theory. But the central point, the focus of the inquiry, simply concerns speaking about conscious experience, which I'll also call reporting on conscious experience. And this inquiry into report is really quite extraordinary when you start to get into it, because it's so everyday and unquestioned on the one hand, but also weird, subtle, and mysterious when you get into it on the other. So simply, if I ask you what you see inside this red circle, you'll say, I assume, something like a picture of green leaves, or perhaps with a bit of prompting, greenness. And almost everyone, perhaps except Dan Dennett, thinks it's obvious, almost unquestionable, really, that it's the very greenness of this blob that causes, or is causally implicated in, or plays some part in this report of greenness. Now, frankly, in an everyday mode, it seems insane to even question this. But note that verbal report, that is speaking, must involve the brain's control of the body, the mouth and the vocal cords, for example. And as the paper and associated work shows, the ability of matter-constituted systems, such as a brain and a body, to reliably and meaningfully report on qualia-valued information like greenness is one of the greatest, most overlooked, and I would argue most fruitful scientific questions of our time. Now, I'm slightly misusing the philosophical term qualia here, simply to label the property of being any component of conscious experience. And to review a modern scientific understanding, over here in the matter realm, we have a tree. We have photons going from tree to brain, and we have brain activity, which then informs the instantiation of a conscious experiential representation of a tree, including these different kinds of greenness. So we use terms like greenness to distinguish qualia-valued information over here in the experiential realm from the green wavelength of a photon over here in the matter domain. And once we've made this distinction between non-qualia valued conventional measures on the matter domain, like wavelengths, the distinction between all that and qualia valued constituents of the experiential realm, like greenness, we can ask that crucial question again. Under what conditions can qualia valued information be reliably reported by a matter system, such as a brain-body combo? And again, the everyday intuition is that qualia-valued information report happens. So whatever the conditions are, they must be satisfied in our reality. But this intuition might not be scientifically reliable. For example, take the sun's apparent daily circling of the Earth. Now, it's in taking a scientific perspective that the everyday and obvious starts to yield to the subtle and mysterious, because according to currently mainstream physics, we can explain all reports made by the brain-body matter system without talking about qualia-valued information at all. That is, current physics claims that if we track all the matter interactions from photons hitting the eye through brain dynamics and to the movement of the mouth, saying I see greenness can be fully explained in terms of matter alone. And this denies any meaningful role for greenness itself in the report of greenness. It's only the green photons in the matter realm that matter, according to this matter-based account, even though we think it's the greenness qualia in the experiential realm that are driving report. For example, imagine we hook a light meter up to an MP3 player and have the combination say greenness whenever green wavelength light is present. Now, this solely mainstream physics explanation says that human report is just a big, complicated version of the mechanical, presumably experience-less sound generation of that hookup. Now, this is a huge problem because it creates a conflict between the very foundation of science, physical theory, and one of our strongest and most profound intuitions, that experience itself matters, both in report and other behaviors. But maybe there's a way to reconcile physics and intuition. For example, in the case of the sun and the earth, we can understand the everyday interpretation of the sun circling the earth on a daily basis, while acknowledging a more natural physical frame in which the earth circles the sun every year and revolves on its own axis every day. So there's been a huge philosophical kerfuffle about experience and report. I won't go into all the different conflict resolution attempts here, except to say that almost none of them work. Instead, I'll just focus on what seems to be the most popular view in consciousness science at the moment, which is that conscious experience is an emergent property, just like temperature, T. If we can meaningfully, as long as we're careful, say that temperature has a causal role in melting, then surely we can meaningfully say conscious experience has a meaningful role in report, analogously. So the reasoning here is that we can analyze melting of ice with or without invoking temperature, and both levels of explanation are physically sound. And why can't we do the same with conscious experience, explain report with and without invoking qualia valued information or experience itself, and have both be physically sound and meaningful? Now, unfortunately, for what passes for current consciousness science, this, just like temperature analogy, doesn't precisely hold. And that puts us back in the impasse between powerful direct intuition and physical theory. So to see this, note that every conventionally emergent property, like temperature, simply corresponds to some numerically based labeling of groups of low-level states in the matter realm. We don't have to leave the set of number-valued explanatory items in conventional physical theory to do this sort of conventional emergence analysis. But a theory of conscious experience takes a numerically based characterization of a particular system, a human brain, and then says, when this system satisfies certain numeric conditions, we have to bring another kind of information in to give a full account of what is happening. We have to bring in qualia valued information. Now, this doesn't mean, as philosophers have argued about ad infinitum, that we have to introduce a new substance different from matter, or new fundamental physical entities, or any kind of dualism. It just means that any physical theory capable of speaking about or describing conscious experience must contain symbols for conscious experience. And these symbols aren't inherent in the existing physics symbolism because they are qualia valued, not number valued. Now, once we recognize the need for additional qualia valued symbols to describe experience, we can see that experience isn't conventionally emergent. I use the term qualia valued emergence to describe the mainstream hypothesis right now. So for those familiar with quantum field theory, we could think of certain brain states then as creation operators for certain combinations of qualia valued states. But this highlights the problem. Information flows from brain to experience, but not from experience to brain. So in a conventional form of qualia valued emergence, the brain is generating report and the brain is generating experience, but experience itself, qualia valued information, has nothing to do with report, even if that report is of things like greenness. And so this is how the intuition versus physics conflict must go according to current status quo physics. And this is weird, but according to mainstream physics right now, it's what's happening. But to jump back to the title of this presentation, it also means that consciousness science, at least conscious experiential science, is impossible, because none of our reports have anything to do with experience itself, despite our super strong intuitions that they do. That's where the subtle mystery I mentioned earlier comes in. And this whole picture is what I mean by dynamically orthodox physics in the paper. Qualia valued states depend on brain states, but can't influence them. Now, there's another possible reconciliation in the intuition physics conflict, namely that everyday intuition is right and qualia valued information does actually directly influence report and behavior. But this would require a coupling from experience to brain, or between qualia valued information and conventional physical dynamics. And this is what I call dynamically unorthodox physics, the ability for qualia valued information to be transferred into brain activity. Now, this would be a radical revolution in physical theory if it actually occurs in the human brain. Although I should emphasize that the revolution would solely concern information transfer, and it wouldn't appeal to duality, to a non-material mind substance, or anything like that. So the message of the paper is that if reality is dynamically orthodox, we can't do conscious experiential science because the only system we know to be conscious, the human system, doesn't actually generate reports meaningfully about experience under those kinds of dynamics. And conversely, which is the headline, the title result, for conscious experiential science to even be potentially viable, reality must be sufficiently dynamically unorthodox, in fact, of a form I call strongly dynamically unorthodox, which I'll explain in a moment. So now let's look at how the paper delivers that message in a more rigorous way than we've developed so far, although in the 10 minutes remaining, I'm only going to overview that rigor, not give a full account of how and why the paper is rigorous. So to begin at the end, the two key results from the paper state what I just said a couple of slides back in a more precise and slightly different way. So T1, theorem 1, uses a definition, D6, that we'll come on to in a bit, to define dynamical orthodoxy. And theorem 1 says that analyzing experimental data about conscious experience in a D6 setting is unscientific. Now, there's a subtle but important nuance here concerning what setting means. It could refer to the reality we inhabit. If reality itself is D6 orthodox, T1 says we can't do conscious experiential science ever at all. But there's another possibility, in fact, the one I believe to hold. The reality setting is not D6 orthodox, but we can use an inappropriate scientific setting that incorrectly assumes D6 orthodoxy. In fact, that's what mainstream consciousness science does right now, uses a D6 orthodoxy. And we can say without further ado, if T1 is true, that is, that mainstream consciousness science is not a part of science, independent of reality, for reasons we'll come on to. Now, in the other direction, this remark points towards the result that if a certain D10 form of unorthodoxy holds, then consciousness science is not provably impossible. Now, with a minute or two's thought, you'll see that not provably impossible is the minimal condition for any scientific methodology. We might like stronger things, like provably possible or provably coherent, but this is the least that we need. So T1 refers to an experimental science, and proving T1 starts with looking at experiments about conscious experience. And specifically and uncontroversially, we can conceive of these experiments as involving two kinds of recording device, recording two kinds of data. Something like an EEG apparatus or an fMRI machine to record brain data, and then some other kind of report, behavioral or verbal, to record data about conscious experience. Again, using the word meter for a data recording device, we can think of verbal report as a meter for conscious experience, And this whole analysis will also apply to other non-verbal behavioral reports about experience. So the key issue following our informal analysis in part 1 will be, what are the conditions for verbal report to be a scientifically reliable meter? And the paper just draws on uncontroversial 1950s mathematical physics, which itself uses the Hamiltonian mathematical characterization for the dynamics of a total experimental system, here in equation 1, involving the measured system, the meter or measuring apparatus, and the interaction between system and meter. And simply, for the meter to be a reliable measure of some system property L, the interaction term here in equation 2 must describe a coupling between a meter property P and the system property L that's to be measured. And it's the use of this Hamiltonian formalism for scientifically reliable meters that gives the technical reasoning of the paper its meter Hamiltonian name. Now, to use a mathematical physics approach to meter reliability, we're going to need a mathematical symbolism for conscious experience. And quite astoundingly, to date, there hasn't been one. So the paper uses this innovation, which I call angle bracket symbolism. So if a symbol S in conventional physics labels or points to an experienceable feature of the physical environment, then angle brackets S labels or points to the corresponding feature in conscious experience. So angle bracket symbols are qualia valued. For example, if S is a symbol labeling the green wavelength of a photon, then angle brackets S would label the greenness of a corresponding experience. So the first thing we do with these angle bracket symbols is in D7 here to define H1 and H2 as two competing hypotheses for contents of conscious experience in an experiment as two different angle brackets lists. There must be some competition or uncertainty about the contents of conscious experience, otherwise we wouldn't need to collect report data. Essentially, the meter of report must be arbitrating between two hypotheses, H1 and H2, in the paper. But again, is verbal report a reliable meter? So we return to the meter Hamiltonian formalism from a couple of slides back, now with the angle bracket symbolism in hand. And in equation 3, we simply restate equation 2 as a requirement for any conscious experience meter. It must couple a meter degree of freedom P with qualia valued states angle brackets S subscript L. Now, this equation simply says that a matter-made meter must couple with qualia valued degrees of freedom if it's to act as a meter for conscious experiential experiments. Put simply, such a meter must move matter differently depending on whether greenness or redness is present in experience. Now things move really quickly once we have equation 4. So first we define dynamically orthodox physics. This is the D6 that I mentioned. There are a few nuances in here, but the most important one is a careful definition of causality, specifically in terms of e-causality, to capture the definitive assertion of dynamical orthodoxy that qualia valued states can be conditional on conventional physical states, but there can be no transfer of qualia valued information to those physical states. Now, as we've seen before, the requirement for the meter is exactly that there is such a coupling. So these two together directly establish T1. There can't be D6 conscious experiential science because equation 3 can't be satisfied under D6, and so there can't be any reliable experiments. In the other direction, what are the minimal conditions for a conscious experiential science to exist? D10 defines something we haven't seen before, namely strongly dynamically unorthodox physics. Now, in principle, if greenness, but not any other qualia valued state coupled with matter, that would be dynamical unorthodoxy because it would violate D6's definition of orthodoxy, but coupling of greenness alone wouldn't support conscious experiential science. We also need redness, blueness, middle C-ness, warmness, and all these things to also couple. So strong dynamic unorthodoxy says all of these things couple to matter, which is then the minimal condition for conscious experiential science, in the sense that if it holds, we can't use the Meta-Hamiltonian argument to show that report must be unreliable. It may be unreliable on other grounds, but not because nature itself forbids degrees of freedom in conscious experience to couple with matter. So we can't have conscious experiential science under dynamical orthodoxy, and we could under strong dynamical unorthodoxy. So what kind of dynamics does our reality actually have? Now that is an experimentally testable question, and I would argue the single most important experimental program for science as a whole right now, in large part because the critical dependency of conscious experiential science on dynamical unorthodoxy transfers over to science as a whole, at least to the conventional understanding and construal of scientific process. Now, there are some orienting hints about this transfer in the paper, but you'll have to look at the From Gödel to Trump book that I'll mention in a moment for a fuller account. So, to sum up, properly accounting for qualia valued information is the key. Conscious experiential science is provably impossible under dynamical orthodoxy, and not provably impossible under strongly dynamical unorthodoxy. Now, the orthodoxy, unorthodoxy question again is an experimental issue, one which I'll say a little bit more about in a moment. And finally, currently mainstream, high-profile headline consciousness science is not science. It assumes dynamical orthodoxy and then claims to study qualia, which we've already seen is impossible. So if you've enjoyed this presentation, please check out the paper that it talks about, obviously. You might also enjoy two other related presentations, and in particular, the one experiment presentation explains how to find out if reality is orthodox or unorthodox. And finally, for that expanded in detail exposition of all of this, including the experimental aspects and the implications for science, mentioned briefly in the paper, please check out the book From Gödel to Trump. And so you can find all of this material and more at the Center for Dialogue in Science website, cfdis.org. I'm Nicholas. Thanks so much for watching. Hope to see you again soon.